Millfield was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked. Maple trees lined Main Street, their branches forming a protective canopy over the sidewalks. The town square hosted farmers markets on Saturdays, and everyone knew everyone. It was picturesque, peaceful, the sort of place where tragedy seemed impossible. My father played first base for the Millfield Mavericks, a softball team composed mainly of fathers seeking reprieve from family responsibilities every Thursday evening. The summer of 1992 was unusually warm, the kind of heat that made the horizon waver and tempers short. But Thursday nights remained sacred. Families would gather at Riverside Park, children chasing fireflies while fathers chased softballs, the air heavy with humidity and the scent of freshly cut grass. That July evening, storm clouds gathered in the distance. The wind carried a metallic tang, the promise of rain that never came. My father later told me the air felt charged, as if anticipating something momentous. Several players commented on Mrs. Peterson's German Shepherd, normally quiet, howling incessantly from 3 blocks away. The Hendersons and Clarks were fixtures in my parents' lives. James Henderson coached Little League when he wasn't approving loans at the credit union. His wife Lisa taught piano to half the children in town. Their twins, Emma and Ethan, were 5 blonde-haired and perpetually grass-stained. I've seen the photographs. Emma with her gap-toothed smile, Ethan clutching his prized baseball mitt. Tom Clark managed Millfield Market, where he'd slip free candy to children when their parents weren't looking. His wife Catherine ran the town library. 7-year-old Lily Clark had just won the spelling bee, and 3-year-old Noah was known for his infectious giggle that could be heard across code playgrounds. After my father's team secured an unexpected victory that evening, the families lingered in the parking lot. I've memorized the last normal moment: James tossing a softball to Ethan, who caught it with surprising dexterity. Lisa braiding Anna's hair while she squirmed impatiently. Lily showing Catherine a firefly trapped between her cupped hands. Noah asleep against Tom's shoulder, thumb firmly in mouth. "We've got Jessica watching the kids at our place," Lisa told my mother, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "And James just got that Belgian beer you love. Come back with us?" My mother was already nodding when I began to scream. Not my usual hungry cry or tired whimper, this was different. Primal. Inconsolable. My face reddened until it looked painful. "What's wrong with her?" Lisa asked, frowning. "I don't know," my mother replied, bouncing me anxiously. "She was fine a minute ago. For 15 excruciating minutes, nothing calmed me. My father walked me in circles. My mother offered a bottle. Lisa even tried her famous baby whispering techniques. Nothing worked. I'm sorry," my mother finally said, exhaustion etching her features. "We better take her home." "Next week," James said, clapping my father's shoulder. There would be no next week. Officer Jenkins noticed something was wrong when Tom didn't open the market the following morning. Tom was famously punctual. His absence spoke volumes. When Catherine didn't answer the phone at the library, Jenkins drove to the Clark house, finding it empty. A welfare check at the Henderson home revealed the horror. 2 men later, identified as Raymond and Victor Sloan, had spotted the families at Riverside Park earlier that evening. They'd driven a Navy sedan slowly past the code playground 3 times. Mrs. Abernathy had noticed but thought nothing of it. The Sloans followed Jessica Miller and the children to the Henderson home, waiting until the babysitter believed the children were asleep before making their move. Jessica and her boyfriend Mike were bound in the living room. The children were tied together in the playroom upstairs. When the Hendersons and Clarks returned at 7 p.m., the brothers were waiting. The rest is public record. The forced trips to the credit union and market, the 683 stolen, the methodical executions that followed, the smallest mercy, the children were killed in their sleep, spared the knowledge of what was happening. My father attended every day of the 6-month trial. Each evening, he returned home a different man. Sometimes he drank until his hands stopped shaking. Other times, he sat in my room all night, watching me breathe. My mother found him there one morning, tears streaming silently down his face. "I keep seeing them," he whispered. The twins were wearing matching pajamas. My mother developed her own rituals. She checked the locks 3 times each night. She kept a baseball bat beneath their bed. For years, she couldn't look at photographs without imagining the crime scene photos my father described from the trial. When school friends asked why my parents were so protective, I invented explanations. It wasn't until my 18th birthday that my mother finally told me everything. There was something wrong about that night, she said, hands trembling around her coffee mug. When you started crying, I felt cold. Not the air, something inside me went cold. And I swear, when we were driving home, the clock on the dashboard froze at 11. 7 for nearly a minute. She reached for my hand. I've never believed in guardian angels, but whatever made you cry that night saved our lives. Sometimes I wonder why us and not them. After learning the truth, I began having dreams. In them, I'd walk through the Henderson house, each room frozen at 7 p.m. Emma and Ethan sleeping peacefully, Jessica and Mike laughing on the couch. The Hendersons and Clarks coming through the front door, smiling. Then shadows would gather in the corners, and I'd wake up gasping. The Sloan brothers remain imprisoned. Raymond died last year of pancreatic cancer. Victor sends birthday cards to a girlfriend in Cincinnati. Life, perversely, continues. The Henderson house was demolished. In its place stands a small garden with 8 rose bushes on for each life lost. Sometimes when I visit, I hear faint laughter on the breeze. Once, I saw a child's footprint appear in the freshly fallen snow. Though no children were present, Millfield seems normal now. Doors are locked at night. The softball league continues without my father. New families occupy old homes. But every July, my parents and I place white lilies in that garden. My mother always shivers, regardless of the heat. My father stands silent, hands in pockets, and I listen for what might have been ghostly echoes of lives that should have continued, voices that should have grown older. Sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I glimpse blonde children running through the garden. When I turn, they're gone. Just shadows and flowers and the weight of gratitude mixed with grief. For a baby's inexplicable cry that drew a line between 2 future San where we joined our friends that night, and one where we lived to remember them. Sarah Jenkins shivered at the roadside, thumb extended. The late September air in Pineville had turned unexpectedly cold as dusk approached. At 15, she'd never hitchhiked before, but missing the last bus from Jenna's house left few options. A blue sedan approached, slowing gradually. Sarah's stomach tightened, not quite fear, just the natural wariness her mother had instilled. Just one ride, she thought. 20 minutes and I'll be home. The car stopped. The window hummed down, revealing a man in his 40s with neatly parted hair and a pressed shirt. Need a lift? His smile seemed genuine, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Yes, please. Just to Oak Ridge Drive. Sarah noticed her reflection in his sunglasses unnecessary in the fading light. Robert Miller, he said as she slid into the passenger seat. Buckle up for safety. A faint metallic smell lingered in the car. Copper-like. Sarah dismissed it as motor oil. The radio played softly an oldies station. A strand of blonde hair clung to the dashboard. Sarah wasn't blonde. Late to be out alone, Robert observed, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. His wedding ring caught the light gold band with a scratch across it. My friend's mom usually drives me, but she had a migraine. Sarah's voice sounded small in the enclosed space. Robert nodded, that same smile flickering at the corners. Teenagers, always causing worry. At the intersection, Robert should have turned right toward Oak Ridge. He went left. My neighborhood is the other way, Sarah said, her mouth suddenly dry. Shortcut. His smile twitched. Construction on Main lately. That's true, Sarah thought. There has been road work. Yet as familiar storefronts gave way to fields, unease pooled in her stomach. How much further? She asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Not far now. Robert's voice had changed flatter, harder. The mechanical click of the door locks engaging sounded like thunder. He's just being safe, Sarah told herself. Mom locks doors in bad neighborhoods too, but they weren't in a neighborhood at all anymore. Just empty fields stretching into darkness, the headlights cutting through increasing wilderness. I think there's been a mistake, Sarah said, reaching for her backpack. Maybe you could just... No mistake, Sarah. He hadn't asked her name. The car accelerated. The tires hummed against gravel now, a rhythmic sound like whispered counting. Sarah's hand found the door handle, pulled uselessly against the locked door. Robert's breathing changed faster, shallower. "My parents are expecting me," she lied. "They know where I am." "No, they don't." The politeness vanished from his voice, replaced by something hungry. "They think you're at Jenna's for another hour at least." How does he know Jenna's name? The question floated distantly in Sarah's mind as terror closed her throat. The car turned sharply onto a rutted path, branches scraping the windows like desperate fingers. The interior light caught something in the back Seat hatchet, cleaning rags, rope. What followed was 8 hours of hell. Pain had a voice. It screamed in colors Sarah had never seen before. Somewhere in the back of Robert's car. Later, on the ground by Blackwater Creek, where the dirt smelled of decay and abandoned things. When he finally dragged her from the trunk, Sarah was beyond speech. Beyond everything except the will to survive. Robert seemed different, now methodical, almost calm. The hatchet gleamed dully in the moonlight. "Nothing personal," he whispered, as though granting absolution. The first strike was a shock of white heat. The second, almost a relief. Sarah watched her own blood splash against fallen leaves bright, arterial crimson against dead brown. The sound was wet, decisive, final. Her body tumbled down the ravine, a broken doll discarded by a careless child. The embankment was steep, 30 feet of loose dirt and jagged rocks. Each impact drove what little air remained from her lungs. When she finally stopped rolling, the silence was absolute. Not even crickets dared to sing. The mud beckoned cold, thick, primordial. Sarah pressed her ruined arms into it, feeling the earth drink her blood, the pain receding beneath a greater numbness. The mud filled her mouth, gritty and bitter. It coated her naked body like a shroud. "Move," something inside commanded. "Move or die here." Throughout the night, Sarah inched upward. The mud became both enemy and friend, slowing her progress, yet stanching her wounds. Sometimes she thought she heard Robert's voice on the wind calling her back down. Sometimes her father's voice urged her forward. Hallucinations came as blood loss mounted. The trees whispered conversations. A woman in white watched from between distant trunks, only to vanish when Sarah blinked. Something scuttled beside her rat or raccoon before disappearing into underbrush. Dawn found her at the highway's edge, a creature more ghost than girl. The sun revealed what darkness had hidden the true extent of her mutilation. Sarah couldn't scream, hadn't the strength. A red pickup appeared, slowed, then accelerated away. The driver's horrified face burned into Sarah's memorapale, mouth open in a perfect O. In that moment, she understood she had become something monstrous, something to flee from. "I am the horror story now," she thought, with strange clarity. The white station wagon approached more slowly. Inside, David and Emma Thompson were discussing breakfast plans when Emma screamed. They stopped. They wrapped her in their honeymoon beach blanket. They drove faster than law allowed. "Stay with us," Emma kept saying, her wedding ring new and shining. "Stay with us." Sarah tried, for their sake more than her own. Recovery was measured in small victories, learning to use prosthetics, the first time she fed herself. Each nightmare that didn't come, each phantom pain that subsided. Robert Miller was captured 3 months later, attempting to abduct another girl. Sarah testified, her voice stronger than anyone expected. Newspapers called her brave. Doctors called her resilient. Sarah called herself lucky, though the word tasted wrong on her tongue. Years passed. Sarah finished school, wrote a memoir, started a foundation for survivors. But some wounds never fully closed. She still slept with lights on, still checked her locks 3 times each night, still avoided blue sedans and blonde men, still woke shouting, feeling mud in her throat and the phantom weight of arms long gone. The smell of motor oil made her vomit. The sound of tires on gravel sent her heart racing. She kept her home painfully neat, no clutter, nothing that could hide threats. Her television remained on perpetually, voices filling spaces where memories might creep in. Robert received 50 years without parole, but sometimes Sarah dreamed he'd been released early. In these nightmares, he stood outside her bedroom window, older but still smiling that same smile. Sometimes she felt watched in grocery stores, at traffic lights, in parking lots, a particular prickling sensation between her shoulder blades that no reassurance could dispel. One evening, 10 years after, Sarah returned home to find her front door unlocked. She was certain she'd locked it. Security cameras showed nothing. Police found no evidence of entry. "You probably just forgot," they said. "Happens to everyone." That night, Sarah sat awake until dawn, baseball bat across her lap, watching shadows shift across her living room wall. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps. But she kept the bat closer after that. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, she could swear she heard the mechanical click of car doors locking, followed by the distant hum of tires on gravel, counting down to something unspeakable. In Pine Haven, autumn came early. The Mason house stood at the edge of town where wilderness began, surrounded by pine trees that whispered on windy nights. To 14-year-old Rebecca Mason, it was simply home until it wasn't. That June night clung to her skin with unusual warmth. Crickets pulsed outside her window as Rebecca drifted between consciousness and dreams. Across the hall, 9-year-old Sophie stirred at an unfamiliar sound, the distinctive squeak of the third floorboard, the one they all stepped over. Her eyelids froze half open as a shadow passed her doorway. The shadow paused at Rebecca's door. Sophie watched it dissolve into her sister's room. A muffled gasp, fabric rustling, then whispers, "Don't make a sound or I'll hurt your family." Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs, thud, 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 thud. The floorboard squeaked again. The shadow reappeared, larger now. Two silhouettes moved as one. The front door opened, closed, gone. For 17 minutes, Sophie remained perfectly still, waiting for Rebecca to return. But the silence stretched, unbroken, except for crickets continuing their song as if nothing had changed. Detective Harris had seen his share of horrors in 23 years, but the hollowness in Diana Mason's eyes haunted him most. 3 months after Rebecca's disappearance, the search parties had dwindled. The Masons' refrigerator displayed a single photograph, Rebecca with her chestnut hair falling across one eye. "We're still following leads," Harris told them, the lie bitter on his tongue. Sophie sat in the window seat, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass. Sometimes she stopped suddenly, as if listening to a voice only she could hear. "She barely sleeps," Diana confided. "When she does, she wakes up screaming about voices." Not voices, Sophie thought. Just one voice. I know it. But the voice remained maddeningly familiar, yet unplaceable. In the beginning, Rebecca fought. The cabin where Elijah Porter took her smelled of pine sap, and something sour or desperation, perhaps. The single room contained a wood stove, a stained mattress, and a woman with vacant eyes who introduced herself as Clara, Elijah's first wife. "You belong to us now," Elijah told Rebecca, his fingers digging into her arm. "God delivered you to me, just as he delivered Clara 7 years ago." Rebecca screamed until her throat bled. She clawed at the windows nailed shut and threw herself against the door. After her first escape attempt, he kept her chained to the bed frame at night. After the second attempt, the lessons began. Hours of Elijah reading from his handwritten Bible, forcing Rebecca to repeat his twisted psalms, denying her food when she refused to answer to her new name. "Rebecca Mason is dead," he would whisper. "You are Sarah now, my blessed wife." Clara watched with empty eyes, sometimes nodding along to words she had heard hundreds of times before. By the 4th month, Rebecca stopped fighting. By the 6th, she found herself whispering Sarah when asked her name. Something inside her was dimming, a light being methodically extinguished. At night, she would press her forehead against the cabin wall and try to remember her mother's face, her father's laugh, Sophie singing off-key. But these memories grew thin, replaced by Elijah's scripture and Clara's empty eyes. Is this how Clara began? Rebecca wondered. Did she fight too, before she became a ghost? "We're moving." Elijah announced as Winter thawed. God has shown me a new path. They traveled by night in a van with blacked-out windows. Rebecca No. S. Sarah kept her head down, reciting Elijah's teachings. The community where they settled resembled mismatched teeth, embedded in the mountain Siddaram-shackle buildings, united by their rejection of the outside world. Here, Elijah's unusual family didn't raise eyebrows. Long skirts and covered heads were the norm. Sarah was dressed in layers of fabric that covered every inch of skin except her eyes. A veil obscured her face whenever they ventured beyond their home. Sarah isn't permitted to speak to outsiders, Elijah would explain, one hand resting on her back. It's our sacred way. 3 times Rebecca, Sarah, came close to salvation. Once at a gas station, where her gaze met the clerk's in the security mirror. The clerk looked at her too long, sensing something wrong. Elijah hustled her outside. That was a test, he hissed. You failed. The punishment was 4 days without food. The second time was at a library where a guard noticed her trembling hands. The guard approached, asking casual questions. Behind her veil, Rebecca's mouth formed, "Help me," but her voice had withered from disuse. The third time was at a supermarket where an elderly woman tried to make conversation. Sarah observed silence with strangers, Elijah explained, his smile knife sharp. Each time, Rebecca remained entombed behind her veil, Elijah's threats echoing. Each time, the person who might have saved her drifted away. At night, Elijah would read from his scriptures. "You're learning," he would tell Sarah. "Soon you'll be perfect, like Clara." Sometimes, Sarah would catch Clara watching her with an expression between envy and pity. In those moments, Rebecca would resurface, wondering if Clara had once been someone else too. 9 months after the kidnapping, Sophie sat bolt upright in bed, her nightgown plastered to her skin. Outside, an owl called. "Miss Porter," she whispered, the name surfacing from her subconscious. It was Mr. Porter's voice. The realization was so sudden that she wondered how she could have forgotten. Elijah Porter had trimmed their hedges last spring, had fixed the trellis, had commented on Rebecca's garden. The next morning, her parents listened with desperate attention. Detective Harris was more measured. 9 months is a long time, Sophie, he said gently. Memory can play tricks. It was him, Sophie insisted. Check his toolshed, has pictures. This last part was a lie. Sophie had never been in Porter's toolshed, but she knew adults needed evidence. Harris agreed to run a background check. What he found disturbed him. Elijah Porter had left the day after Rebecca's disappearance. Before moving to Pine Haven, he had been questioned about a missing girl in a neighboring state. Most damning was a complaint from a previous employer who claimed Porter had spoken of divine messages, instructing him to claim a pure bride. It was enough to justify surveillance. A week later, Harris followed Porter's van to a department store. Porter was accompanied by a gaunt woman and a figure draped in dark fabric. Harris watched as they separated. Porter heading to the register, his wife lingering in an aisle, and the veiled figure drifting toward the book section. Heart pounding, Harris approached. "Rebecca?" he asked quietly. "Rebecca Mason?" The figure stiffened but remained silent. "I'm Detective Harris from Pine Haven. Your family sent me. Your sister Sophie remembered." "Are you Rebecca Mason?" The veiled head turned slightly toward Porter, then back to Harris. Through the fabric, he could see eyes frightened and familiar from the photograph he'd carried for 9 months. A nearly imperceptible nod. "Do you want to go home?" A second nod. More definite. Within minutes, the store was surrounded. Elijah Porter was arrested, screaming about divine right. Clara collapsed in tears, babbling confessions. And Rebecca was freed, though the psychological chains would take years to break. The police car pulled into the driveway as darkness fell. The neighbors gathered, bearing witness to a resurrection. Sophie waited on the porch steps. Rebecca emerged slowly, her movements hesitant as if expecting to be yanked back into darkness. For a long moment, the sisters stood facing each other like strangers. Then Sophie whispered, "I knew I recognized his voice." Something in Rebecca's facade cracked. Her composure, that brittle shell Sarah had built, shattered completely. Later, Rebecca would tell them everything. The cabin, the chains, the slow death of herself. She would describe how Elijah had built walls in her mind. The worst part wasn't the pain. She would confess in therapy. It was believing him. The chains had left scars, a bracelet of raised tissue on her ankle, but the invisible bonds had left deeper marks. 2 years after her return, Rebecca stood at her window, watching shadows lengthen. Behind her, Sophie sprawled on the bed, her presence an anchor. A movement at the forest's edge caught Rebecca's eye flicker between the trees. For a moment, she saw a familiar silhouette. He's in prison, she reminded herself. But as twilight deepened, Rebecca found herself checking the window locks repeatedly, found herself wondering if Sarah was still there, inside her. Sometimes in dreams, she still wore the veil. Sometimes she wondered if she had ever truly escaped. The most terrifying predators aren't those lurking in shadows, but those who walk in daylight, capturing not just bodies but minds. Rebecca closed the curtains, but couldn't shake the feeling that something still watched patient, waiting for her to answer to a different name.